Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Interconnection Process Enhancements 2023 stakeholder meeting to discuss the issue paper and straw proposal. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm also joined by Elliot Manzier, President and CEO of the California ISO, Neil Miller, Vice President of Infrastructure and Operations Planning, and Bob Emmert, Senior Manager of Interconnection Resources. As a reminder, the presentation and agenda for this meeting can be found under the Policy Initiatives webpage under the Stay Informed tab of our website. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We try to structure these meetings to stimulate dialogue, engage different perspectives, but we also do ask that you please keep comments professional and respectful and try to refrain from repeating anything that has already been said. If you have questions throughout today's meeting, you can ask questions a few different ways. If you are connected through WebEx on your computer, you can use the raised hand icon there above the chat window. You can also submit questions through the chat to myself or to all panelists. And if you are connected through audio only, you can press #2 to join the queue. When you are asking a question, we do ask that you please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. If you need any technical assistance during the meeting today, you can send a chat to the event producer or any other questions, send a chat to myself, Caitlin McGee. So today's agenda, we'll start off with Neil with some introduction on the IPE process and opening comments. Bob will take us through the IPE 2023 Track 1 and Track 2. And then I'll close out the meeting with the next steps and the initiative schedule. We'll have plenty of time for questions throughout the discussion today. And then lastly, here's just a quick overview of the ISO's policy initiative stakeholder process. As you can see here, we're at the very beginning of this process for the IPE 2023 initiative, starting with the issue paper and straw proposal again, which is what we'll be discussing today. So with that, I'll hand it over to Neil to introduce and provide some opening comments.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Hello, I'm Neil Miller, VP of Infrastructure and Operations Planning. And good morning, everyone. And before I launch into the introductory material leading into the Track 1, Track 2 items, I first want to introduce our President and CEO, Elliot Manzier, who's going to provide some opening comments. Elliot?
Good morning, everybody. I'm actually on the road today, traveling back here in Washington, D.C. for a labor conference, but I wanted to take a few moments just to, first of all, thank all of you for your interest and focus on this issue. This topic of interconnection queue reform and just proactive planning and coordination and synchronization is something that's very important to me. I think we all understand the scale of the infrastructure challenge facing California to get ourselves to SB 100 goals and to be able to keep the lights on effectively and affordably. And this set of conversations this year, I think, is going to be particularly important and hopefully impactful. I think we've been looking at this issue for quite some time, a couple of earlier rounds of reforms, but we clearly have more work to do. And I just wanted you to get a sense of personal commitment. I'm very appreciative of the and that we have with the memorandum of understanding last December, and we're committed to working.
Yeah, Elliot, this is Michelle. You're breaking up a little. I'm not sure if you can move up next to a window or move over a little bit because you're breaking up some.
I'm just standing right here. I'm in DC.
Okay, Elliot, yeah, we're still having problems hearing you. Do you want to try dialing back in?
going back in momentarily. I apologize.
All right, so Elliot will be dialing back in. Caitlin, do we want to move to the next module while we're waiting on Elliot to dial back in?
I think it's pretty critical that we have his opening comments right up front to help set the stage. So if we can give him a minute, that would be best.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Actually, well, if we're not seeing Elliot able to rejoin, I will start in, and perhaps Caitlin, you could text
I
Elliot.
think he's back.
Oh, excellent.
You know, I'm not gonna waste folks' time if my connection isn't good. I apologize. Bottom line, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate the partnership. We have hard and focused work to do to build on the MOU and to take our transmission planning and coordination and synchronization of queuing and procurement to the next level. So thank you all for the work. Thank you all for your focus. I look forward to real progress here in the months ahead. So Neil, thanks to you and the team and to all the partners. I'm going to pass it back to you, and I apologize for the technical problems this morning. Thank you.
No problem, and thank you, Elliot, for fitting this in. All right, I'll start moving through some of the other material, and I think this was some of the material Elliot alluded to in his comments, really about what is driving the need for significant change and transformational change through our Interconnection Process Enhancements 2023 version. We do see that some significant changes and reforms are needed here, largely to accommodate the pace and the accelerating pace of new resource development. I want to just emphasize that 2 years ago, our transmission planning work was keyed off of adding roughly 10 gigawatts of new capacity over a decade. Last year's transmission plan was keyed off adding about 27 gigawatts being required over a decade. This year's transmission plan is keyed off of 40 gigawatts, and the portfolios that we'll be studying next year have already been approved by the Public Utilities Commission and key off of a requirement to add 70 gigawatts of total capacity, not point of interconnection capacity, but installed capacity of all types of resources. That acceleration puts us in a spot of it's critical that we adapt our processes to manage both the additional throughput requirement that our processes have to accommodate, as well as the expected additional interest from the resource development community in meeting those needs. If I could move to the next slide, please. So to provide some context, also as Elliot had indicated, this is part of a larger set of framework improvements that we see touching on a number of different aspects. The strategic direction was really set out in the Memorandum of Understanding that the ISO, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Energy Commission signed in December 2022, setting the direction for tightening the linkages between resource and transmission planning activities, interconnection processes, and resource procurement, that these activities have to work together in concert and with tighter linkages than they have in the past to manage the volume and the cadence of new resource development that we see necessary. Within the interconnection process itself, we see these additional reforms necessary to leverage that improved coordination set out in the Memorandum of Understanding and to further break down the barriers to moving resources forward more efficiently. So while this direction was already moving forward, if I could move to the next slide, please. What really called for us to have to pull the trigger to getting moving now on these process changes was really reinforced by the more recent developments in terms of what's happening in the interconnection process itself. First, we did this informal survey last year looking for what type of interconnection application interest we would see in Cluster 15 and saw some very, very significant numbers showing up. As well, we also saw our highest percentage and the highest number of projects in cluster 14 moving forward from their phase 1 study results into phase 2. So these data points taken in concert really reinforce that we need to move, and we need to move now on putting together these process enhancements to tighten those linkages and to make better use of our planning and engineering talents, both at the ISO, with the transmission owners, as well as with the resource development community itself. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to turn it over to Bob Emmert to walk through the initiative itself, as well as how the team have structured the initiative. Bob?
All right. Thank you, Neil. Thank you for setting the stage, and good morning, everybody. So to get into what we have in the issue paper and straw proposal, we have proposed 2 tracks to go through the various items that we want to tackle in this 2023 IPE initiative. The first track will focus on immediate adjustments to the cluster 15 schedule. This will allow for the completion of cluster 14 phase 2 studies and for track 2 changes to be put in place. We need to make sure that track 2 is completed in order to really understand how we plan to proceed with cluster 15 and beyond, and how those will be studied. Track 1 is an accelerated timeline. The next paper will be a final proposal, and we'll be going to the board with that final proposal in May, and then following that, filing with FERC before the cluster 15 validation is due to be completed. And I guess what I mean by that is we'll talk about that later, but we won't be actually validating, but the cluster 15. So we want to make sure that we get a filing off to FERC prior to the cluster 15 validation due date. Track 2 will focus on changes to the GitApp cluster study process needed to achieve the MOU goals. It is to be completed, including board and FERC approval prior to resuming the cluster 15 interconnection request validation of the study process. So if we could go to the next slide. So for track 1, which is in essence the straw proposal of the paper, the first item of that is it's really related to the schedule for cluster 15 and what we were proposing to how we were going to handle cluster 15 from the initial point moving forward. So the plan is to accept cluster 15 interconnection requests during the normal open window, which this year is April 3rd to April 17th. Perform the completeness review of the interconnection requests received during the open window and finalize the list of interconnection requests deemed completed by May 1st, 2023. So the idea with that is that we will continue to adhere to the 5-day review requirement during the period where we're reviewing interconnection requests for completeness. But once we have hit the date where there's no longer an opportunity for correction of incomplete IRs, we are proposing not to necessarily adhere to that 5-day period and complete the review of all interconnection requests for completeness by May 1st. After that, we will postpone the validation of cluster 15 interconnection requests, project scoping meetings, and studies. And the plan is to restart Schedule 15 process on April 1st of 2024, which to the ISO seems to be the ideal time to restart this, as it maintains the the coordinated schedule that we have between the GitApp process and the transmission planning process. And also provides time to complete cluster 14 phase 2 studies and develop and finalize the GitApp changes in track 2 that need to be completed and in effect before the cluster 15 phase 1 studies begin. So next slide, please. There is a potential for a need of extending the cluster 14 phase 2 study schedule. Restarting the cluster 15 process on April 2024 assumes that the cluster 14 phase 2 studies and results meetings would be completed within the current cluster 14 tariff schedule. The current proposed cluster 15 schedule is subject to the current cluster 14 tariff schedule being maintained. However, I will state that there is some room for minor adjustments to the cluster 14 phase 2 schedule, as long as the phase 2 reports come out in time and the scoping meetings, or excuse me, the results meeting are completed before April 1st, 2024. At this point, why don't we stop for questions?
All right, we do have a question in the queue from Susan Schneider. She has her hand raised, so go ahead.
Hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me, Bob?
Yes.
Hi, okay. I just had a couple of clarifying questions. The issue of cluster 14 potential delays, when do you think that call will be made? Because it seems like you're anyway, let me just leave it at that. Now, when do you expect that call to be made in terms of whether that would delay, and then possibly then, you know, sort of the sliding delay into the April 2024 resumption for cluster 15?
We're hoping to make that call very quickly. We're hoping that we'll, through the comments that we receive in this set of comments that are due in a couple of weeks, that we will at that point in time know if there's any need to extend the timeline in a manner that might actually hinder what we proposed in the straw proposal for handling cluster 15.
Okay, so sometime around maybe the end of the month or something like that, people should know what's going to be happening, maybe before the window opens for cluster 15.
I think that's a possibility.
Okay. Okay. The current schedule, where you've got the scope, or excuse me, the results meetings for cluster 14 finishing in February, and then April 1st having the new window open, it seems like you could go possibly a little earlier, like maybe open them in March. Is there some, is that just meant to give some additional leeway in case you have to go a little longer?
When you say open them, I'm not sure what you mean by
okay,
that.
let me make that a clear question. If you're going to be finishing the results meetings for cluster 14 in February, you're waiting till April to open up restarting the cluster 15 process instead of doing it in March. Is that just to give you a little bit of leeway, just in case you need some extra time to finish up the cluster 14 process?
Well, the idea, I think, was that really re-engaging in April in the standard timeline that we typically would do puts us back on track with how the process is designed to work now, and starting up a window early, I don't know, really gains us a whole lot. Well, I guess we'll have to really see how things play out and what the final proposal comes out of track 2 to know if extra time might be needed. On the other side of that coin, I would say there may be a possibility to actually utilize some of that time if we, I think there is a possibility that we would extend the timeline a bit for cluster 14 phase 2 for the getting the reports out, as well as completing the results meeting. So I would anticipate at this point that it's fairly likely that we'll utilize that time for cluster 14, for completing cluster 14.
Okay, I was thinking in particular about the fact that people would, if they're going to be modifying their requests, which they're allowed to do at around this time for cluster 15, or to give them any additional time for validating or for meeting deficiencies in the validation process, that time might be usable for that purpose.
Yeah, I think frankly, though, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves on that. We'll have to just wait and see how track 2 really plays out.
Okay, and then I guess the other question is sort of a clarification on the FERC process for this whole thing. It seems like you would have to go to FERC after the board approves this whole thing, and then it normally would take 60 days. I assume would you be asking for expedited processing? Do you have a backup plan if somebody challenges it, or can you just talk a little bit about the FERC process?
Well, I don't know if Bill wants to take this one on. I think I probably ought to defer to him.
Yeah, there's always some level of risk, but we've seen PJM, we've seen just us with the supercluster have success here, at least in implementing a pause. I mean, I think FERC certainly understands that all the other ISO RTOs are experiencing this challenge right now, and need some leeway as we address it and transition toward the future.
Have you had any discussions with FERC staff about it?
About this specifically, I mean, we haven't yet. We've been, I would say, FERC is well aware of the interconnection queue challenges we're experiencing, and we have a lot of frequent conversations, but we're putting it to stakeholders first, and then we'll probably take it to FERC once we feel that we have something that has consensus and we want to take forward.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. Those are all the questions I had.
Thank you, Susan. We also have a question from Dariush. Go ahead.
Can you hear me, Bob?
Yes.
Okay. The track 2 changes that you intend to work on with stakeholders on a longer term basis, rather than track 1, which you want to wrap up very quickly. The changes in your protocols and procedures and tariff and so on will be applicable to cluster 15, correct?
Yes, cluster 15 and clusters
and beyond
that follow.
Beyond, if there is one, okay. So there is a discussion among developers. Of course, I'm with CalWIA, California Wind Energy Association. I work with a lot of developers, and they, as far as what I'm seeing here, is a lot of developers want to avoid the shotgun approach of cluster 14. They want to go with targeted applications where it makes sense. And there is a lot of information that is not available for them now. I mean, we are where we are based on all the events of cluster 14 and the issues that the low attrition rate in cluster 14. We are where we are. But people want to make sure that we don't do this shotgun approach that was used by some developers in cluster 14 and cause this clogging of cluster 14. So they are very focused on making sure that they submit intelligent applications where it matters. And there's a lot of information that are going to become available in the next few weeks that that would help in that regard. For example, TPP report will come out, final TPP, not the one that's going to get approved yet, but will come out on April 4th. We know some information on short circuit duty capacity of breakers will become available in late March. And of course, there's these new rules that are going to be adopted in cluster as part of track 2 that could impact people's willingness to put application into the queue. And also the fact that smaller developers, especially, which I'm hoping the goal is not to push them out of the picture, are going to, if they put their application now, and more or less $650,000 deposit that goes with it, they have to basically have that money locked away from them for a whole year before they go to scoping meeting, and based on the scoping meeting discussion, decide that they want to withdraw the queue. All of that is a preamble, and the fact that FERC is quite aware of the issues involved and probably very open to making quick decisions on this. all of this is leading me to ask whether it's possible to have this window for cluster 14 or cluster 15 open several months later, where people can actually, my interpretation, reduce the number of applications as opposed to try to rush whatever they could get in so that they could probably adjust it within the next year. And at the same time, a lot of maybe smaller developers becoming discouraged by the fact that they're going to be putting $650,000 with CAISO and not seeing it for a whole year and maybe 14, 15 months back after the scoping meeting for the project is over. So maybe it's a plea or maybe a question, is whether it's possible to consider a later cluster window, maybe 3-4 months down the road, where people have had the ability to digest all the useful information that will come out of CAISO, plus the track to evolution, if not final outcome, in order before they would submit an application and plug cluster 15 like it happened in cluster 14. I said a lot. Thank you.
So Darius, we're not going to obviously make any decision on this call. So please provide that in your comments, and we'll see what the predominance of comments state related to doing something to that respect.
Okay. Well, the fact that you're open to hearing these comments, that's encouraging. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we're not closing the door to anything. So, we're looking for what you think is, from your perspective, the best approach as well. So that's why this is an issue paper, and it is just a straw proposal, but we do need to move quickly on this particular issue. So yeah, the more detail you give us in your comments, the better off we'll be able to consider them and consider the ramifications of what that would look like.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. We also have a question from Jasmine Guan. Go ahead.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Bob. Thank you so much for going over the track 1 rules. This is Jasmine from AES Clean Energy. I just had a quick clarifying question in regards to the completeness review. Can you clarify what would go into the completeness review in terms of requirements, and specifically what would be the rules for site control starting for cluster 15? Thank you.
Yeah, that's all laid out in our tariff in the BPM. Trying to remember the section 3.6, I think is the tariff section that outlines that there are 10 specific items that are required for the completeness check. So if you go into the tariff as well as the BPM, that describes what those 10 components are, and all 10 components are required by the time the window closes this year on April 17th. The BPM does go into some level of detail related to site exclusivity of what the requirements are to actually meet site exclusivity. And there's also the option that if you are not able to meet those requirements for site exclusivity, that there is a deposit in lieu of site exclusivity, and describes that process as well.
Okay, thank you so much. That's helpful.
Thank you. And then we also have a question from Alan Combs on the line. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. This is Alan Combs with New Energy Works Consulting. I guess I share some of the views that Darius expressed in terms of additional information that could inform Cluster 15 applications. But can you specifically explain why you're not simply delaying Cluster 15 window until you sort a few phase 1 items out? That's a little bit lost on me.
Well, I think initially we didn't think it was that we wanted to just come out and delay it. We thought there's a lot of people, frankly, some of this information related to what's going on with cluster 14, how many projects we were expecting in cluster 15 came out fairly recently. And we know of a number of interconnection customers that are working for developing their cluster 15 interconnection requests. And, we didn't think it was fair to them that we might delay this when they were ready to submit, and they may be thinking, well, the best case for them would be to open the window on time and close the window on time, and so that those that were prepared for cluster 15 were the ones that would be moving forward. Any delay could actually result in more interconnection requests coming in. So
if I may,
just to finish, my thought on that is that we understand there's a tension there that other developers may be in that same boat, and we have been developing their projects, but want more time. So we're open to, understanding your perspective on this and reading your comments on this. So please provide your comments on what you think you'd like to see, how this would play out.
Sounds like I'm not hearing CAISO has the ability to either file a tariff waiver or immediately make a filing to adjust the cluster window. I'm not hearing that as a reason. I guess what I would add is that I doubt there are many developers that are prepared to file interconnection requests with cluster 15. But I don't think that's based on the expectation that the application would be parked literally for 11 or 12 months, which is kind of the base proposal here. Now, I know that that's open to discussion, but what I am hearing is this proceeding is going to look at a lot of things that might prioritize what moves forward in cluster 15 or subsequent clusters, and that would inform what goes into cluster 15. So to the extent you're going to delay actually initiating a study for, on the order of a year, I'm really struggling to understand how that's just and reasonable to let it sit there for a year or not reopen it. And if you're going to reopen it, why did you have it in the first place? So I'll leave it there. But I guess I'm not hearing that CAISO couldn't close, delay the window. I'm not hearing that there's some legal reason that it couldn't take that initiative quickly. I mean, you've started the stakeholder proceeding in the middle of the time that all the developers are preparing applications. I'll point that out. That itself is a burden.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alan.
All right.
Thank you. And we do have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is from Dennis Daniil. The question is, this proposal to delay cluster 15 will pose problems for LSCs to meet the CPUC mandates, as any new project will be unable to know when they can come online. Is the CPUC aware of this?
Yes, the CPUC is aware of this at some level. They didn't see the full-blown proposal until it came out for everybody. So they're in the same boat as everybody as far as, reading through it and trying to decide what their reactions may be. However, there have been discussions just related to the overall interconnection process and the MOU that Neil and Elliot both spoke to. So they understand the need to develop a process that more closely aligns all of the processes between interconnection, bringing new interconnections on, studying those, doing the resource planning process and the transmission planning process. So they're fully aware of the issues and the concerns that we have and share those concerns.
And Bob, it's Neil here. I'd just like to add to a bit more color to what you've just said there as well, that as the team went through the previous rounds of interconnection process enhancements following cluster 14, I believe it was apparent to all industry that that level of volume cannot be accommodated in those normal timelines. As more and more applications come in, the complexity actually increases more exponentially as opposed to linearly. So the team, I feel, did a wonderful job last year working through more incremental enhancements to the existing interconnection process, looking for refinements to help achieve some better outcomes for cluster 15. But when we're looking at the volumes in cluster 14 moving through into phase 2 and the expectation of another approximately equal volume or similar volume arriving in cluster 15, that really requires an additional look at the process And also the measures last year based on those survey results are clearly not achieving the desired effects of producing more manageable volumes, more aligned with actual procurement interest. There is a lot of procurement interest. You know, as I mentioned, the volume of new resources we need to add to the grid. There are a lot of projects in the queue. There are a lot of projects in cluster 14 moving into phase 2. So the cluster 15 phase 1 results were going to be impacted with these volumes. It's a case of how best to manage that impact and how to be best prepared when we do address cluster 15. So I hope that helps just to provide some additional context for this, because clearly the cluster 15 volumes were going to require a shift, and that this is what we're trying to address. Thanks.
Thank you. We also have a question from David Corzelius. Does the CAISO anticipate returning to overlapping cluster studies after cluster 15 starts? Or does the CAISO anticipate that all clusters going forward will complete both phase 1 and phase 2 studies before starting the next cluster?
Well, I think at this point it's premature to try to come up with what we think it will look like. We've got a long ways to go. We haven't even really developed a full-blown proposal for track 2 yet, so I don't want to presuppose some idea about what we think that will look like at this point.
All right, thank you, Bob. We do have 2 more questions on the line. Shane O'Brien, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, Bob, this is Shane O'Brien with IPA Power. Don't want to belabor what was already stated, but just want to say that we do share and echo a lot of the previous comments that were made. You know, it seems a little disingenuous to open the queue right now if the ISO is not prepared to start actively administering those projects and moving them forward in the study process. I do, you know, as far as new comments, I do want to make sure that the CAISO is looking at this as holistically as possible. And I understand there's a lot of things to be factored in here, but you know, similar to some of the comments that were made earlier, the ISO had previously made commitments through some of the data transparency initiatives that happened over the last couple of years. And we've yet to see some of the actual work product come out of that process, despite a repeated follow-up. And so, you know, I think we're overdue for a general update to the stakeholder body to understand where those various tracks that left that process landed, especially because a number of those data items, you know, folks were seeking to, again, make better, more informed decisions prior to entering the queue. I think the other thing that really needs to be kept in mind here too is by taking the projects now, when there's, you know, potentially further changes down the line that could impact how these projects are processed and additional requirements or changes to them in the study process could greatly affect those project outcomes and actually increase speculative requests. I think both that, the extended timeframes, the delay in the study process, you know, a lot of folks were worried about the in-service dates of their projects already. And so, you know, again, just want to make sure that you guys are factoring that in, that, you know, you're getting that intended outcome and not actually increasing potentially the speculative projects with those changes. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. And, you know, we put out this proposal, not really having any specific feedback from customers other than, you know, things we've been talking to customers about and questions they've been asking and so forth. You know, I think the door is open for you to provide your comments on what you think is the best approach. You know, currently we're thinking track 2 would take us to the point where we could start fully working with cluster 15 starting in April of next year. You know, that's, I think, probably the end of the window that we might consider, but it's possible we could delay cluster 15 for an entire year if that's what stakeholders feel is the best approach. So, you know, feel free to, you know, put together your comments on what you think is the best approach.
Thank you, we will.
Bob, it's Neil here. I also just wanted to respond a bit to the concern that I heard that there was something, I think the word was disingenuous, about opening the cluster window. You know, just to put a finer point on what Bob had alluded to earlier, the goal here was, because we have been hearing conflicting informal, and it's strictly informal, but informal comments, that there weren't resource interconnections that were seeking to get into the queue, get their place anchored, notwithstanding that coming out of cluster 14, it was accepted generally, I think, that or the original tariff timelines couldn't be met. So it really is a trade-off among those who wish to get into the interconnection queue, have their grouping associated with cluster 15 established because that's what they've been driving to and they're ready, versus extending the window that may result on one hand with people shaping their requests as Darius suggested, or on the other hand, other projects that weren't originally lined up to apply to cluster 15, taking advantage of a few extra months to get proposals developed and applied. So there is, so we are looking for comments about that trade-off there. And then Bob, just about if people did apply, could you just clarify what the expectation was if someone applied and then decided not to move forward during that period where we're not working on the cluster 15 projects?
Yeah, so within the paper, we did briefly lay out a potential opportunity that once the cluster 15 window closes and we're further along in the stakeholder process, that we were proposing that kind of a drop dead date where projects could actually withdraw from the process and get their money back with no monies utilized from their study deposit. We probably would have to wait for a FERC order to allow us to do that, but that's something that we were thinking could be an option that people would appreciate, is having the chance to, once they've put in their interconnection request and deposit and been deemed complete, that if for whatever reason, if they decide that, maybe we really don't want to have our money hanging out with the ISO for this amount of time, and the way the stakeholder process may be looking, it may allow for them to come back in later in cluster 15 that they may want to withdraw their project. So that is something that we are proposing at this time.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, we do have a question from Rayanne Quadro on the line. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Rayanne Quadro with Gridwell Consulting on behalf of EDF Renewables. I have lots of questions about the details of the paper, but the only two things I really want to communicate right now, sort of at that macro sense, is it's hard to understate exactly how important these changes could be, given how much influence the CAISO has over the development industry and thus the California economy, right? And so I wanted to confirm first that this next paper that you'll be publishing is not the final paper for track 2, but only the final paper for track 1, that there will be several proposal iterations to talk through the content of track 2. A lot of the ideas in there are very interesting, but I don't feel prepared to weigh in on them opinion-wise without quite a bit more meat on the bones, as they say. Neil, I see you nodding. That's really reassuring.
We are on a pretty fast track to go to the board in May, and that's only for track 1 because we're, right before us is cluster 15. We have to deal with it and get whatever changes we need to incorporate to revise the schedule for cluster 15 to FERC as soon as possible. We've got a long road ahead of us for track 2. Even though it's a fairly short road, we are currently anticipating going to the board with our final proposal in December of 2023. So it's not a lot of time, but yes, there's a lot of work to be done between now and going to the board in December on track 2 items.
Awesome. I'm sure that was in the paper too, but it gives me peace of mind to hear you say it. And then the other thing I wanted to ask about was sort of two-pronged. The first one was, it sounds like you're in the beginning stages of coordination with the CPUC on this item, and I kind of wanted to implore you to partner with them a little closer on this and maybe to some event, this could be like a joint effort. The CPUC currently has an open IRP process. I know that the CAISO is participating there, you know, and I really appreciate that. But to the extent that schedules are overlapping or concepts are overlapping, the CAISO is talking about some screening measures, for example, in track 2, but the CPUC already has screening measures, some of which are public, some of which are a little bit more opaque. And so, you know, just to make sure that screenings aren't happening twice or not happening not at all, and that stakeholders can participate in both venues, would be really helpful. You know, I know it's a lot to ask to get the joint agencies together to do stuff like this, but I think this is important enough to do that. And so some sort of master schedule there would be really appreciated.
All right, well, please provide that in your comments.
Certainly will. And then finally, can you, Bob, or Neil speak to today the status of the Open Deliverability Initiative that we got a white paper about earlier this year and are sort of expecting to launch this quarter?
Neil, I could touch on that. That's the deliverability technical review.
It's an initiative on the website. It was, you know, sort of a menagerie of topics about how deliverability study methodology could be changed. There were a lot of stakeholder input, and I think the next step was for the CAISO to sort of weigh in on the merits of those changes.
Yeah, so thanks. I can give an update on that. So yes, last year we were responding to a number of one-off issues, some more technically grounded than others, to be blunt about it. And we did put out an update just to clarify, rather than trying to deal with the different questions and inquiries on a case-by-case basis, we put together a bit of an update paper. The team is now working on an issue paper with a lot of information for background. And the plan, we're still on track for getting that issue paper out the door at the end of the month. That falls on a Friday, so it may end up on April 3rd as opposed to March 31st on a Friday, putting something out. But we are looking at launching this deliverability methodology review. We are going to be keen to see if there are legitimate opportunities to adjust our deliverability methodology. And we have in the past made adjustments where there were, I'll say, technical reasons for doing so. We also need to respond to a number of questions and comments that came up where clearly we need to do more education on the topic. So we see that in effort being both. We have not identified at this point that there are changes that need to be made, but we're committed to going through the technical review and exploring if there are opportunities. Does that help?
Absolutely. That really answered more questions than I even asked. Thank you so much. I feel very well informed. And those are the only 2 items I wanted to bring up right now. Thanks for holding this meeting today. And, you know, I'm excited to get to work.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right, we do have a couple more questions in the chat. The first one coming from Venkat Nagulapalli. The question is, for completeness review, does the applicant need to cure deficiencies in the cluster 15 before close of the window April 3rd through 17th?
Yes. The way it's set up is we will seek to give people a response to their interconnection request, whether it's complete or not, within 5 business days of I think it's business days or calendar days, of receipt of their interconnection request. So if you get your interconnection request in early in the process, within 5 days, we'll give you an answer whether you're complete or not. If you're not, we'll tell you what you're deficient in, and you will have an opportunity to cure that as long as you get that done before the 17th. However, if you get an interconnection request in late in the process, we may not be able to complete your review for completeness until the window is actually closed. So there is an opportunity to get a second shot or third shot of in the completeness process, but you need to get your interconnection request in early enough for us to be able to perform that completeness review and provide some input back to you.
All right. We also have a question from Paris Hayes. Is track 1 or 2 expected to impact timelines for CAISO as an affected system studies and responses?
No, I don't think that it will. We'll still go ahead and receive affected system requests and continue to perform those studies. That's our anticipation.
All right, and I think we have our last question here from Aisha Berry. Is there a criteria CAISO has in mind that they might use to consider moving the cluster 15 window? For example, if majority of the comments received do request delaying the cluster 15 window, will they consider moving in that direction? Or any additional information CAISO could use through stakeholder comments to make that decision?
Yes, that's the reason we have a stakeholder process. We want your input, and nothing's set in stone at this point. So it'll depend on, you know, the predominance of what we see from all of the stakeholders that provide comments, what direction we think we will go. You know, based on things, as Neil said, based on things we heard, we took what we thought was our best shot of what we thought is the best way to proceed with cluster 15. But if we find out that from all the stakeholder input that there's a better way or a way that is more desirable by the majority of stakeholders, we're going to take that into account, of course.
All right, we did have a question on the line pop up from Julie Love. Go ahead.
Just a quick question with respect to the site exclusivity in lieu of deposit. Assuming that the cluster is delayed for the entire year, would the same rules still apply as far as the refundability, meaning that after the scoping meeting, it'll be only refundable up to 50%?
Yes, that's what we would anticipate. The scoping meetings as proposed, would not be held until 2024. So we would not be reviewing them. Now, as part of the completeness check, we do kind of do a sanity check to make sure that we think the documents are what are needed, but we don't go into a point of saying, okay, this is a specific component that needs validation. So it has to meet what I kind of call the smell test, that, yeah, this looks like an appropriate document for site exclusivity. It looks like it has the components to make sure that, yeah, this is a valid site exclusivity documentation. But we won't go into an actual process to cure any specific deficiencies if we think it is an appropriate document until the validation process.
Great, thank you.
And we do have another question in the chat from Andrew Webster, just to confirm what happens to a request if a completeness review is not completed by cluster close window. Does this result in a withdrawal?
It results in the interconnection request not being accepted, and we would refund whatever funds you provided to us if you had provided funds.
All right. I am not seeing any additional questions at this time. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Bob, and all of our participants for a thoughtful Q&A. Bob, I'll hand it back to you to continue our presentation.
Okay, let's move down to the next slide. So along with the track items that we just discussed, we will also include other issues for consideration for long lead time resources. Offshore and out-of-state wind resources face unique challenges that may warrant special consideration. State policies have identified need for both resource types and for transmission planning to address their needs. Offshore wind leases covering nearly 400,000 total acres of central and northern California coastline have been awarded with potential to produce more than 4.6 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. Out-of-state wind intends to use a subscriber participating transmission owner model to connect significant amounts of wind to the ISO, which provides important operational and state policy benefits. So if we could move to the next slide. These resources are large and have long lead times that create challenges in obtaining timely power purchase agreements from load-serving entities. Offshore wind development also has challenged by the need for massive new supply chain development and construction infrastructure requiring state level attention. These timelines are unique compared to the more quickly sited and constructed solar and storage projects that make up the bulk of interconnection requests. So the issue comes down to a delayed Cluster 15 schedule may impair development of these resources and California's policy objectives for supply diversity and reliability. So the ISO is raising this issue for consideration and comment. Since this is within Track 1, the ISO seeks definitive comments for the development of the final proposal. So we realize there's not a lot of time here, but we wanted to lay out a potential opportunity to do something unique for Cluster 15 projects that either are offshore wind or related to out-of-state wind. And is there enough interest to carve out a special process for them to go ahead and be studied on some timeline while the remainder of Cluster 15 is put on hold? So we're looking for stakeholder feedback on this issue. So why don't we open it up for questions on this item?
All right, we do have a hand up from Susan Schneider. Go ahead.
I just had Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. It seems like some parts of the concepts you've mentioned could help with this situation. For example, I think there's part of the proposal where you talk about only allowing projects that have PPAs to go into phase 2, but that's something that you would have to, and I know this is probably part of Track 2, but that was something that would help with these long lead time arrangements. If the PPAs could be signed sooner, then maybe these projects wouldn't need so much special treatment either in the TPP or in just the regular interconnection process. And it just seems like those things are somehow are related somehow, or could be related.
Yeah, I think our concern is that most of these projects are very far from a mode of actually getting a PPA. And the longer they're delayed, the longer it's going to be before they can actually get one and actually move forward. So we're just wondering, should we give them special circumstances related to all those issues? Because I don't think that they're, other than, them having a lease, that is kind of the first milestone that you might say, hey, these projects have something to demonstrate for their readiness. But other than that, there's really not much else out there.
Okay, I mean, it does seem like they could submit, particularly the out-of-state wind, but also these guys, the offshore wind, that they could. I think there has been a couple of applications in the queue, and one that actually has FCDS now.
Yes, there are some Cluster 14 projects that I can't really, it's confidential information, but some may have gotten leases. So there may be, there's going to be a mixed bag of projects within this realm.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone, there are 3 ways you can ask a question. You can use the raise hand icon above the chat window. You can dial #2 if you're on an audio only line, and you can submit questions through the chat and I'll read them aloud. And please do remember to state your affiliation when introducing yourself and before asking a question. So we do have a question from Jennifer Scott in the chat. Her question is, similar to wind and offshore wind, pump storage hydro also is a large, long lead time resource and should be treated similarly. Maybe
okay,
a comment.
please provide that in your comments.
We also have a hand raised from Rayanne Quadro. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Rayanne Quadro, Gridwell Consulting on behalf of EDF Renewables. I am wondering how deliverability might be treated for these long lead or for these non non-delayed project types, I suppose. You know, the CAISO has asked what LSCs are looking at in terms of what's helpful from them from the CAISO as they do their procurement. And, you know, in these RFO processes, you know, we look at a myriad of different things and provide a lot of information to these LSCs. But deliverability is one of those go, no go marks that a project does not have a TPD allocation from the CAISO. They're not eligible to provide RA. So, you know, any RA contract would be null. Is there going to be an accelerated TPD allocation process for these offshore wind developments or out-of-state wind developments? Do you anticipate that also being bifurcated?
Well, currently the process for the allocation of transmission plan deliverability occurs after the studies are completed. So under the current paradigm, if these projects were to be studied uniquely in their own special path and timeline, then as soon as their studies are done, they would be eligible for an allocation of transmission plan deliverability. There are some additional things going on within the transmission plan process for considering earmarking some deliverability for these projects. I don't know if Jeff, you would like to describe that a bit at this time.
Well, it's Neil here. I don't know if Jeff's teed up, so I could jump in first. So maybe just first put it in the context of the out-of-state resources. There are out-of-state resources identified in the CPUC's portfolios, and we've also received direction to ensure that we, for the intrastate requirements to bring those resources the rest of the way from the border to the load, that we consider those needs incrementally to the capacity that's already been allocated, not to projects necessarily moving forward, but allocated in previous deliverability approaches. So clearly there's an expectation there that we're developing incremental in-state transmission capacity to accommodate those resources, which makes the usual deliverability process, I'd say, quite a bit more complicated. So that's just a data point. That's not an answer for how to do it, but that's something we would need to take into account. The offshore wind also have a number of unique challenges. There just aren't that many places to bring the offshore resources ashore. In the Central Coast area, we've been publishing for a few years now the available transmission capacity volumes that can be accommodated in the Central Coast before and after the Diablo Canyon retirement. So the use of that transmission right now seems like there isn't a lot of other competition for the use of that transmission. And then for the North Coast area, essentially for the volumes we're talking about entirely new transmission facilities required that Jeff and the team are working on in the transmission plan. So there are some real differences here around those types of resources that they will be driving additional new transmission and aren't necessarily bumping into other uses. And there is an initiative that was started and looking at perhaps retaining some policy-driven transmission capacity in the transmission planning process for the specific purpose it was planned for, as opposed to today where once it's underway, any resource type can seek to gain access to that. We did defer that because we didn't see an immediate need to get that through in time for this year's transmission plan, but that is another active stakeholder process.
Thank you for that clarification. I think building on that, my comment is that probably at least that element of that initiative needs to be reactivated and considered as we consider these, accelerated tracks for the wind. To me, that you can't really extrapolate one from the other. Your summary is promising, but we want to walk it all the way to the logical conclusion there.
Appreciate that. I hope that helped. I was going to say, I hope that helped clarify by communicating how complicated it was.
No, I mean, I'm with you. I can't
Thank
speak
you.
for anybody else on the call.
All right, we also have a question from Brian Turner on the line. Go ahead.
Hi, Bob and Neil. Thank you very much for the meeting today. These are all very interesting reform proposals, and we look forward to engaging with them. Sorry, Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United. My question right now about these additional considerations. Primarily, there's very little reference into what the considerations mean. Bob, you mentioned to carve out a special process, and then in the white paper, there's continue to explore whether they require separate study timeline or process. And I'm just wondering if you can provide any more detail now or after this meeting about what that means, both for these long lead time resources and then separately for the subscriber participating transmission owner model. What would that look like? What would a separate process look like? Would it be a standard study process, but just carving out for these long lead time resources, or would there be any additional procedural innovations for those resources?
Well, I think my initial reaction is that with the amount of time that we have to develop something in track one for them, kind of the default, I think, would be just our standard cluster study process where, we could possibly have a cluster study for them where they would be on the standard cluster study timelines and just move forward and not be put on hold with the way the rest of the cluster 15 projects work. We'd be willing to listen to any ideas that someone may have related to that, but I think just with the amount of time we have and which means limited time for developing something new, I think my perspective is that just going to the default of the standard cluster study process timelines would be the easiest path forward.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We also have a question from Eddie Dadashti. Go ahead.
Yes, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Eddie Dadashti from Parse Energy. And I just want to let you guys know that that a lot of developers have already signed site control, and they're making payments on the site. So any delay in cluster 15 will have a financial impact, on these developers. So I just wanted to make sure that is clear to everyone. I also have a question about offshore wind. Again, we've done some offshore wind in Pacific Northwest and in California, and these projects tend to be very large, and a lot of coastal areas don't have enough substation or transmission capacity for such large projects. So is there any way that the ISO can have a measured project acceptance for offshore wind? In other words, this year you're doing 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind, the next year another 1,000. If you do, let's say, 4,000 megawatts of offshore wind in a single cluster, that tends to basically screw up a lot of the smaller projects. In one instance, I can tell you 1,000 megawatt project went to a substation at home with 100 megawatts of battery storage, and that totally screwed up all the costs. So I just want to make sure you're aware that a very large, offshore wind project is going to have adverse impact on onshore projects. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Eddie, on the first point, we are, aware that there is a possibility that people may be entering into site exclusivity contracts. And so, whatever comments you'd like to give us related to that, of how that, how we might be able to, deal with your concern, please let us know. Related to the size of projects have the capability of doing multiple projects and multiple queues over time, or larger projects, but then make them phased projects. So there are some levels of or ways to deal with large projects. If you think there needs to be something new and unique in that area, please let us know what you think, what your thoughts are in that area.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we do have a question in the chat from Julie Gill. There are other diverse resources that require this LLT consideration, such as long duration energy storage. Please broaden your definition.
Please provide that in your comments.
All righty. We do have a couple more hands raised. The first one is Alan Combs. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Well, I guess, again, Alan Combs with New Energy Works Consulting. I just need to caution against having the queue be targeted to technology-specific resources. I mean, if you were to look at cluster 14 and not characterize it as just being a lot of speculative requests or a super cluster, but look at it in terms of the technologies, you'd see there's an unprecedented amount of storage only resources in that queue. And one could say that that was important for midterm reliability and that we should be doing everything we can to accelerate cluster 14 because it holds a special solution for California's resource needs. So just as you want to characterize cluster 15 as maybe catering to long lead time resources, you have to ask yourself, what are you not prioritizing in other clusters? So with long lead time resources, what I'm really hearing to me is, a lack of necessary investment. So will the CAISO be looking at ways to bring in third-party ownership of new transmission assets in California, maybe expanding the way PTOs can get in? I mean, the idea that you would somehow preclude deliverability for existing in-queue resources, it seems so on its face discriminatory, but the idea that if somebody really needs access to the grid, that if they can bring investment, then the CAISO should accommodate it. So I'm just wondering if you're going to be looking at the investment side for new transmission build out.
Well, Alan, if you have ideas that and these obviously belong in track 2, where track 2 is open to discussing those type of new ideas. There's going to be some significant change to how we study projects moving forward. So be looking forward to your ideas related to that. Just to speak to a bit, about technologies, this is the first time we've ever thought of some sort of a carve out of a different unique process for technology types. And the only reason we brought it up at this point is because we were proposing to delay cluster 15 and wanted to get, at least have discussion related to, should we be considering something unique for those long lead time projects that are in the CPUC portfolios for new generation expectations? So, it's only related to this delay that we're bringing this up.
Yes, and Bob, it's Neil here. I know that sooner or later this gravitates to the technology type, but I do think our key focus here was we have some resource types that we see the CPUC wanting to encourage for the diversity benefits they're bringing to the table. It's a relatively small component of the total resource plan being developed by the Public Utilities Commission. And those particular resource types do have some unique challenges in meshing into the rest of the process because of the timelines involved and the complexity of the procurement given the size of the projects. Offshore wind projects, unlike the opportunities on the East Coast, clearly require a significant scope in order to be viable. So there are some very unique challenges there that we were trying to highlight. So we'll look forward to comments on this. And that I heard the comment as well about long duration storage. I hear long duration storage described differently. If we were talking about simply extending the energy output from batteries, they probably don't have the same type of challenges. Some of the pump storage facilities That's where we'd have to take a look at, but also how well their transmission needs can be delineated from the rest of the system, because the more intertwined they are, the harder it is to do something as a carve out. So thank you for the comments. We'll really look forward to seeing your written comments on these topics.
We have a question from Mark Smith. Go ahead.
Hey, Bob. Hi, Neil. First of all, I don't envy the position that you're in with the clusters and the expected level of workload that you have. Obviously, the workload is what's driving your interest or need to delay cluster 15. And I think I get that and I understand that. But the carve out of specific resources, I think, is concerning. I guess two questions. One, will the delay really make a difference in the development of those resources? That might be more of a thought concept than a positive question, yes or no. But more secondly, have you thought through whether the balance of cluster 15 would have to be further delayed as you worked on these preferred resources? And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. The CPUC has demonstrated and suggested that these resources would benefit the system. I get that. It is a preference that you're suggesting, though. Would that delay further the balance of cluster 15?
So Mark, the way I would envision this is if we decided to move forward with this, that they would be on the standard cluster 15 track of going through their, validation, scoping meetings and start the phase 1 studies, so that their phase 1 studies would be completed about the time that the rest of cluster 15 phase 1 studies would begin following, an April process again. So I wouldn't see a delay at all to cluster 15 due to them. It would be almost like kind of having a cluster 15A and B, where some of the projects started in 2023 and some of the projects started in 2024, but no further delay than what is already being proposed. And I do want to just kind of comment a bit on, you mentioned that it's a workload issue. I don't see it so much as a workload issue. If we had access to all the engineers we could get our hands on, and it's still a study process issue that is, in my mind, a bigger issue than just the pure workload issue related to this. We're not, with having so many projects being studied at this point in time, and particularly in phase 2, the phase 2 studies for cluster 14 are not going to be as accurate for the number of projects that eventually will move forward than we really envisioned the process to be.
Yeah, Bob, I guess I don't understand that response, because the reason you're delaying cluster 15, as you've said, is to finish up phase 2 of cluster 14. And if you have yet another cluster 15A going on at the same time, to me, it seems logical that the balance of cluster 15B, as you characterized it, might be further threatened. I don't get that.
Bob, it's Neil here. I'd just like to chime in a bit on that. I don't think Bob's saying it's one or the other. It's both, to be blunt. The resource requirements to conduct these level of studies, not just the ISO, but for the transmission owners as well, is a real issue, and we're not downplaying that. I think what Bob was getting at, though, is that when we look at the cluster study approach, which I think has been extremely robust over the last number of years at meeting our needs, but as we look at layering on cluster 14, such a huge volume, and then layer cluster 15 on top of that, the usefulness of the phase 1 results, unless we get some better reforms in place to help shape cluster 15 and future clusters and future cluster cycles, the usefulness of the results studying layering this volume of cluster 15 projects on top really just isn't giving us the cadence we need to drive through to getting reasonable phase 1 results that people can make decisions about post and move forward into phase 2, when we're looking at this volume applying what looks like now year after year, and only having 2 phases to settle through to actually the basis for a PPA, or I mean for an LGIA. So it's both issues, the usefulness of those phase 1 studies with that level of oversupply in the queue, as well as the workload, because the study work almost grows exponentially as opposed to linearly when you start throwing more and more projects into the same area. Does that make sense? And your concern around with doing anything unique for cluster 15 or for those other projects, could that have an impact on our ability to meet the revised schedule that we're proposing here for 15? I think our goal would be to not have an impact, but that's a legitimate concern. So please provide that as input. Does that help?
Okay. Thanks, guys. Yeah, that does help.
Thanks.
All right, we do have a question in the chat from Ellen Wolf. And Ellen, I'm not sure which organization you're affiliated, so feel free to drop that in the chat for others. But her question is regarding special process for OOS and OSW. How would you plan to manage studies without the benefit of including in the study the other resource types wishing to interconnect in cluster 15?
Well, if I understand your question, kind of as I categorized prior with Mark, having a cluster 15A and B, cluster 15A projects would actually be ahead of cluster 15. So they'd be studied on a standalone basis. And the base case for cluster 15B would include those resources from 15A already having been studied in phase 1. So it would kind of create a 2-step process to where certain projects would be considered sooner and being the base case for the second group.
Yes, and Bob, just tagging on to what Bob just said, it's Neil here. The transmission needs, especially for the out-of-state wind and offshore, are to some extent incremental to the other transmission planning work. So, or the other transmission capacity. So we would be hoping to minimize, but could not eliminate potential conflict between the two. But there is an opportunity there to minimize, given the other unique aspects of the transmission needed to get those resources to load.
Ellen, I do see you raised your hand. Did you have an additional comment? Go ahead.
Hi, this is Ellen. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I sort of get the sequence as you described it, but I guess I just want to confirm my understanding of the implication. That would mean then that the out-of-state wind and offshore wind would sort of have a higher priority on the transmission capability that is available than the balance of the resources that would be studied in the second phase?
I would say to some extent, yes. I don't know, I think these resource types have somewhat unique transmission needs compared to other projects. So, but there would be some overlap, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think, of course, getting them to the bulk system is one thing, but then there are certainly some common large-scale constraints within the CAISO grid that are impacted by those resources as well as other resources, more conventional ones on the grid. So,
yeah, and speaking to the area deliverability network upgrades that are needed for those 2 types of projects, those will be, coming out of the transmission planning process. And I can't speak to necessarily to the size of those projects that will come out of that, but there'll actually be some potential additional capacity coming from those projects for other type of projects as well.
okay, thank you.
All right, I think that is all for questions. I believe we did have a comment come in from CD McLean at the CEC, just noting that potential market power like issues in the cluster study process can anecdotally have impacts. Assessing such potential impacts might be evaluated with RSI, HHI style metrics. So at this time, I'm not seeing any additional questions. So Bob, if you want to continue on the presentation, go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, we did have a question pop up. Sorry. We had a question pop up from Eddie Dadashti on the line. Go ahead.
Thank you once again, Eddie Dadashti from Powers Energy. Regarding offshore wind, we've had some issues regarding site control. Does the ISO have any specific requirement for offshore wind regarding site control?
We did an update in our BPM regarding site control for various types of technologies, and you know, I think we have taken site control for offshore wind into account. That said, I think we're on a bit of a learning curve with that, and are quite willing to make adjustments to our BPM related to site exclusivity for offshore wind projects. So I think we've opened the door to that and have addressed it to some extent, but we can work on that more as we all learn from the overall process that those projects are going through.
You know, I know the federal government, the Bureau of Ocean Management, you know, they have not awarded any lease options agreement yet. That's my understanding. And so if an offshore wind submits an application, will not meet the CAL-ISO site control requirement, with the exception of some interest of some communication with the Bureau of Ocean Management. So I think that would be helpful if CAL-ISO develops some sort of requirement for offshore wind. And then the offshore wind may have, number one, you know, the actual site where the wind turbines would be located, the Gentai route, so that's another site control. And depending whether you have an AC interconnection or DC interconnection, you may have to have a converter station on site. Okay, I mean, it's AC, then it goes directly into a substation or transmission line. And I think those issues need to be addressed for offshore wind. And further, this is regarding, Bob, your earlier comment about phasing a project. The offshore wind requires such a massive investment that it has to be built at a large scale, and it can't be phased that easily. Again, a few offshore winds we've done have reflected that's the case. Thank you.
Well, Eddie, what I was referring to was phasing within your interconnection request and your generator interconnection agreement.
Yeah, as I said, the offshore wind requires such a massive investment that it can't be phased. It has to be all in or all out. That's just the amount of investment it has. They can't meet the revenue requirement with phasing an offshore wind. Well,
what I'm speaking to is, you know, if you've got a certain size of a project, bringing a fourth on by this certain date, another fourth by another date, and so forth through phases that have a somewhat more unique consideration within their generation interconnection agreement. So I think if you take a look at that, you'll find that it's a little different, I think, than what you're thinking.
Well, again, I've been talking to offshore wind companies that actually develop it, and that's what I've been led to believe, that, you know, you're working 35 miles from the shore, you know, and you have to have infrastructures and all that. But what they do, they don't want to go back and forth in phasing a project. They just want to build the whole thing and get it over with. It's just a special requirement of offshore wind. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Eddie.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, Bob, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, well, let's move to the next slide. Okay, track 2 will handle the interconnection process reform for cluster 15 and beyond. So priority must be given to projects that seek to utilize available capacity coming out of the ISO transmission planning process. So projects that seek to interconnect where no capacity exists currently and no future transmission is planned should be given lower priority in the study process, if studied at all. The volume of interconnection requests receiving detailed study results must be tempered to align with the state agency resource plans. So track 2 will explore how to limit project capacity studied to reasonable amounts that support the state's resource planning and procurement needs. And so when we talk about reasonable amounts, what are the amounts that we actually have capacity either existing or planned within a study area, studying capacity amounts and that will be utilizing that capacity and not vastly greater amounts than that capacity that's available either now or in the future. Better alignment with load serving entities, resource procurement functions is needed, and opportunities for alignment are planned to be explored within the track 2. And so we posed a couple of questions related to that. Do detailed and individualized studies of the current phase 1 and phase 2 study process provide truly useful information in the procurement processes of the load serving entities? And would faster but less precise information based on more generic study processes better serve the information needs of load serving entities within their procurement processes? Next slide. So getting into what we call elements for consideration, we developed in track 2 a number of elements to kind of specifically look at components that we thought could help us within this overall process that we're trying to seek and within what's been really outlined within the memorandum of understanding and working more closely with all the various planning processes that are going on in the state. So element 1 is to accept or process only interconnection requests where the transmission system has available existing or planned capacity. Limiting the studied process to zones or on the transmission system that have available capacity, either existing or planned, would focus project development on areas where transmission has already been approved and moving forward to accommodate new resources. Element number 2 is to limit the number of interconnection requests in the study area that are based on transmission capability being planned for that particular area. Limiting interconnection request intake and study processes exclusively to zones where existing and planned transmission capacity is available will likely continue to result in excessive numbers of interconnection requests unless other steps are taken. And what that means is even if we get all developers to say, okay, I understand I've got to put in an interconnection request only to an area that actually has existing capacity, I don't know that that would vastly decrease the number of interconnection requests that we receive. So we'd be looking for additional methods that would be needed to limit the number and megawatts of interconnection requests analyzed in each of the study areas to amount based on available and existing planned transmission capacity. So next slide. So continuing with element 2, could resource screening criteria be developed to filter the list of projects to only those that will receive detailed analysis? It is possible that screening criteria alone would not reduce the eligible capacity to an acceptable level for each study area, and it is likely that additional methods for reducing capacity would be needed. So towards that end, we need to consider methods such as an auction or other methods for reducing project capacity to levels that are commensurate with the amount of currently available or future capacity in each zone. So some questions that we pose related to this: could generic study results from previous or current studies be provided to projects not selected through the screening in lieu of performing more thorough studies for such projects? Could projects not selected through screening be rejected and not studied at all? Or could projects not selected be studied in a slower, lower priority process? So these are some questions that we've posed in the paper to stakeholders. Next slide. Element number 3 is require projects to have a PPA to be shortlisted to proceed into the phase 2 studies. This seems like a viable way to really study in the phase 2 projects, or projects that really are ready and have a high probability of moving forward. We would need to consult with the procurement entities to determine the viability of this approach, and we plan on doing that throughout this track 2 process. And element number 4 is only open the new interconnection request window when warranted. So we'd be exploring criteria such as new interconnection request window would not open until capacity in the queue drops below a predefined amount. And for example, total capacity in the queue, or the capacity that has not executed generation interconnection agreement in the queue is at a certain level. So overall, these elements can be considered together or individually. And in addition to these, the ISO seeks stakeholder input on alternative elements. So please be as specific and detailed as possible in your comments to these particular elements, as well as to any elements that you would propose. So that concludes the slides for track 2. Let's open it up for questions.
All right, we do have a question from Rianne Quadro. Go ahead.
Hi, Bob. My question is regarding transparency for data and the element 1, I think it was, for screening of interconnection requests. I recall earlier in the I process in 2021, I guess, that some of the data transparency items requested by stakeholders were not going to be possible for the CAISO to produce because of the difficulty of the cluster study process, specifically, you know, as it pertains to deliverability and it not being sort of a straight number as to how much deliverability is available in any one particular place. And so I guess I'm wondering how these screens can be applied if sort of the amount of interconnection that the system can accommodate can sort of shift depending on where interconnections are actually requested in the cluster. And I guess I'd like to ask then if the CAISO can create these screens, if these screens and that data can be transparent on the front end, not as something for the CAISO to reject, but for stakeholders to consider before they even submit their interconnection requests.
Yes, Ryan. Admittedly, along with these, you know, the possibility of moving forward with these various elements, that there's going to be a burden on the ISO to provide additional information. We recognize that, and so we will be looking at that, trying to figure out what's the best way to provide information to enable developers to determine where they should seek interconnections. And I think that will be coming out of both the interconnection process as well as, I think, potentially out of the transmission planning process. So we're well aware of that, aware of the need. And if we raise the bar for asking for projects to meet certain metrics, we're going to have to provide information to enable developers to meet those metrics. So we understand that.
Thanks.
And Bob, it's Neil here. I just wanted to chime in and building off my some of the introductory comments, that whole issue of keying off of resource planning conducted by the state, us better shaping our input, the product in the transmission planning process to help shape where the transmission capacity may exist, but also where it's being planned for and the volumes to help shape those future interconnection requests is something we're also looking at in this year's transmission plan. That's a work in progress right now as we drive to the posting of the transmission plan at the end of the month. So that's the goal, is to help provide that direction on volumes and a zonal approach to where interconnection requests would be targeted. I think on the transparency side, and that'll be a separate topic, but some of the data requests in the past focus on more developers wanting to understand, I'll say, their competition within the zone as opposed to whether or not that's a preferred zone as reflected by state resource planning. And that's, of course, where things get a bit more complicated on the competition among the resource development community, as opposed to what are the good areas where transmission is being planned for. Does that help?
It does help, and I think to hear you refer to it as zones more so than as like points of interconnection clarifies that a little bit for me. We've had lots of conversations with transmission planning and understand that how much interconnection or deliverability is available in areas dynamic based on where other interconnection requests are submitted. I'm really glad to hear and want to reiterate my support for the CAISO participating at the CPUC. I think one of the things I see between the two spaces is that the CAISO has almost no energy-only interconnection requests in its queue, and the CPUC is expecting or allowing for a lot of energy-only projects in its predictions. And so some sort of realistic reconciliation between those two things would be helpful. I'd hate to think that that's just phantom megawatts in the CPUC's base case.
Appreciate that.
Rayanne, this is Deb Levine. Let me jump in on the data transparency status. We do have actually currently in user acceptance testing. So as promised, before the end of Q1, I've got the rest of the month, we will be publishing an updated Q report that includes the transmission deliverability, the planning area, and the suspension status of projects. So that's what we had committed to as far as Q1 is concerned, and we're on track for providing that. By the end of Q2 is where we're looking to have the additional data on a per resource ID basis available for public viewing as a separate report on the website. So we are working on that. We're really close on the user acceptance testing because it's the updated Q report, and we're working on the resource specific data at this point.
Well, I think I speak for a lot of stakeholders when I express enthusiastic gratitude for that movement. It's going to be huge for us in terms of data analysis on the stakeholder end.
And along those lines, you're going to see a lot of energy-only projects.
Exactly. All right. Thank you.
We do have a question in the chat from Sandra Kim, who is with Samsung. So if these elements are taken into account before cluster 15 validation, then some projects that are deemed complete this year may be eliminated from the queue or set lower priority in 2024.
I'm not sure. It doesn't sound like there's a question there, but I don't think it would actually change the completeness of any projects. It would potentially require all the projects in cluster 15 to go through a screening process and to determine which projects move forward. As described in the slides for track 2, some projects that meet the screening criteria and any other criteria that we put in to decrease the amount of megawatts in each zone to what we think is the appropriate amount. Those projects, some projects could move forward. Other projects we're in the mode of trying to decide and need your input on, and what's the best way to handle projects that don't make the cut. Do we just say thanks and try again next time, or do we have a separate, slower, lower priority study process for those types of projects that don't make the cut for the study? So we're looking for stakeholder input on that.
All right. We have a question on the line from Bridget Sparks. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Bridget Sparks with AES Clean Energy. I have about 3 questions. Do you want me to ask them all at once or kind of go in order?
Well, let's start at one at a time. Go from there.
Okay. So the first question is on element 3 of requiring PPAs to go into phase 2. And we were wondering if the CAISO would consider PPAs with non-LSC entities. There's a large interest from corporate stakeholders to procure their own clean energy to fulfill their own sustainability goals. And I know in the last round, there were allowances made for these contracts and eventual time to sell off the RA. And we were wondering if those same sort of accommodations could be applied to element 3.
Oh, I would definitely assume that's what our initial starting point would be to continue with what was approved by, well, what actually is before FERC right now, assuming they approve it, that we'd be continuing to use that same process for those type of PPAs.
Great, thanks for that clarification. Next is, when we were reading through these proposals, and obviously these are just ideas, and we're definitely very sympathetic to the pressure that the CAISO is facing to meet the state's goals and provide developers with accurate results in a timely manner. But one thing that kind of raised to my mind was squaring these proposals with the open access principles that FERC has laid out. And so our concern is, if you're only opening the queue occasionally, like element 4 is suggesting, how does that kind of align with the interconnection NOPR that is requiring annual cluster windows? Is this potentially discriminatory to resources if you're only studying projects in certain zones and not the whole system? And so just kind of concerned about how these proposals might impact open access. And just any thoughts, or if you guys have, be interested in Bill's thoughts on, how y'all think these proposals can kind of pass FERC approval, since they are, quite different from what was in the interconnection NOPR that was released in June.
Well, I won't wade in very deep on this issue and leave it to Bill to talk more about open access issues. But we are aware of that issue before us, and some of the things that we are raising, such as projects that don't make the cut, do we study them at all? Is that a concern would that be a concern to FERC? So we're aware of those type of things. I think within the Track 2 process, we're going to have to work through all those issues, and if there are some barriers to open access, figure out a path to deal with that. So we don't have an actual path at this point, and we're looking for stakeholder input throughout this Track 2 process of how to deal with those issues.
Yes.
Any further thoughts, Bill?
Sure. I mean, obviously, open access is always a concern. It's like one of the big questions, the ISO needs to ask itself is why we're here. When we tried to address this with the supercluster and the previous site, and part of the answer could be that we were still a little too focused on open access and ensuring open access, and we erred a little too hard in that direction. But it'll always be a concern, and we'll want to keep FERC apprised of what we're thinking and make sure what we're proposing passes muster. In general, with regards to the interconnection NOPR, I mean, I think we just have to proceed as if it's not happening for the time being, and take it as it comes to us. Looking at Order 2003, looking at Order 845. It's quite a big evolution from what you see, in the initial petition in the NOPR to the final order. So it's hard for us to make assumptions and make predictions based on just what we've seen in the NOPR. And so I think we have to proceed on our own for the time being. And that's what the other ISO RTOs have done and are doing. And FERC has been receptive. I mean, if anything, FERC in the NOPR and in other proceedings has said, that the transmission providers should work on these things in the interim in any case.
Great, that's helpful. And then my last question is sort of thinking through the new risks that these proposals will create. So my first kind of thought on this was the potential to increase costs for ratepayers. So I could see a scenario in which, you know, for element one, where you're kind of restricting studies to only certain areas, you know, obviously everyone's going to know to target development in those areas, which could increase land costs, which, you know, could increase ultimate project costs. The other thought is by kind of restricting development to just what's sort of indicated in the IRP, I could also see a scenario where we're just doing kind of just in time, just IRP procurement, and whether or not that creates enough slack in the RA market where, you know, if projects can reach that kind of final stage, if there's not, you know, competition has been so sort of weeded out in an attempt to like limit the number of projects in the queue, you know, will that increase RA contracting prices? So just be curious, especially like, you know, the ratepayer advocates and, you know, LSCs to kind of think about, you know, if we're, just any maybe unintended consequences that these proposals might have with the goal of, you know, kind of thinning the interconnection queue. Does that have sort of negative impacts on contracting prices just given less competition? And then kind of relatedly is sort of, you know, IRP accuracy. You know, we've had, you know, 2 sort of updates to midterm procurement targets. You know, they, a couple months ago, just approved another 4 gigawatts of procurement. And so, you know, thinking through, do we need to like look at IRP plus like a 10% adder just to give us that kind of flexibility that, you know, the IRP is like our best estimate of future needs, but, you know, those are all based on like scenarios and sort of future assumptions. And so maybe we should encourage the CAISO to build in a little bit more slack or cushion for errors so that we're not, you know, again, compounding the problem of not having enough resources built in time. So just some thoughts there, and just would love, you know, other stakeholder input on like, you know, risks that these proposals might create, and, you know, so we can fully think through the consequences of these changes. And we'll definitely be putting some thoughts and comments. So thanks.
All right. Excuse me. Thanks, Bridget, for all that. Yeah, I'm not going to weigh into that, but yeah, I'll be looking forward for your comments. And just the fact that you're raising an issue that is, you know, fairly complicated. We've had some internal discussions about, as we go through this process, it may be appropriate to carve out a few issues for some sort of a stakeholder working group process to dig into those issues and help us to develop, you know, proposals to move forward in some of those areas and have more opportunities for, you know, face-to-face or whatever discussions around those type of issues rather than just do the standard stakeholder process to gain more ground more quickly on what's the best path forward in some of those cases. So thank you for that. And yes, please provide your comments.
All right, we do have a question on the line from Darius Mohammadi. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for pronouncing my name. Usually people skip that. Couple of questions. Number one is, I wonder if we are sort of overreacting to what happened in Cluster 14 by sort of trying to bring back central planning. Would it be better to identify, for example, where the capacity is available or will be available based on your planned upgrade, transmission upgrades, and let people to come in and put conditions for letting them go through, as opposed to limiting the number of applications coming in. Limiting competition is typically not a good thing in whether open access or whatever we want to call it. So So I wonder if we should put our focus on areas where we won't limit the number of applications coming in, but we would limit the applications that would be moving forward, or if not later on, the results they will receive will be enough for them to withdraw, as opposed to just limiting the number of applications coming in. And that leads to my second question. I think
can I just address that real quick?
Sure, sure.
We're not intending to limit the number of applications coming in. What we're looking for is some criteria, some metrics to determine which are the projects that are most ready, most likely to be accepted for a power purchase agreement, and those type of metrics to be able to determine these projects are the most ready, most viable, meet the location where we are planning transmission for, and those projects would be the ones that would be, at least in one case, studied quickly to move forward, and the other projects either studied more slowly, or in another case, not studied at all. So we're not looking to limit the interconnection request. We're not looking to, you said limit competition. I think what we saw in cluster 14 was hyper competition to the point where it was much more than what is necessary to have a good competition within it. So anyway, I just wanted to make that statement before we move on.
Thank you. That clarification was very helpful to me. The next question is, when I look at, I've been involved in this process of CAISO interconnection, both from inside and outside, for the past 20 years. And there's been some major reforms, transition cluster, I think 4, cluster maybe 10. We have had major reforms in interconnection study process. I consider the reforms you're discussing now as the most drastic and fundamental of every one of the past ones. Maybe I'm mistaken, but that's how I feel, having been so close to the issue. Would it be okay? I mean, and given that the timeline we have for track 2, would it be wise to focus our attention for the next week or so only on track 1, so that we can get the issue of the cluster 15 window and the process, just the process issues related to cluster 15 window, sorted out before we start looking at and thinking about comments on these really significant fundamental reforms that you're talking about? That was my second question.
So we actually did discuss internally comments for track 2 at this point in time, and we would like to receive those. We are on what I would consider a fairly short timeline to get to the board in December with track 2. So we're definitely wanting your comments on track 1 so we could move forward with track 1 in a way that that stakeholders would be agreeable to, and go to the board and get that taken care of as quickly as possible. We have 2 weeks between now and when the comments are due. So, I realize that's a limited amount of time and some pretty meaty issues to kind of dive into without a whole lot of detail been provided at this point in time. So I realize, the difficulty for that. We'd like to get as best comments we can on those issues to help us to kind of formulate the next steps as we move into track 2. We haven't even developed a schedule for track 2. We're working on doing that right now. But we want to get started on track 2, even with the comments that we received. So granted, I realize your comments may not be, as full blown as they might be in the next step, but at least we'd like to get your initial reaction to these, if nothing more. The more in depth you can give us, the better it is for us to really determine stakeholder thoughts around these issues. But we do realize there's a limited amount of time. So again, I agree with you. Track 1 is what we need to move forward on quickly, and do your best on track 2.
Thank you.
All right, we do have a question from Alan Combs. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Alan Combs with New Consulting. So an area where I expect or hope track 2 comments will be on is other, dare I say, creative ways to improve the transformation of queued resources into operating projects. In one area, I think that deserves more attention is the PTO collector stations for resources. Right now, it's a very set of, well, to me, arbitrary rules about, when the PTO can, what voltages it can accept generation, whether it can facilitate in getting gen-tie access out to a point where, there's the developer can bring its gen-tie in. And I expect you'll see comments suggesting that maybe the transmission planning process as part of the bus bar mapping actually, encourage the PTOs to prove up what substations are available to accept resources. And so just as you're trying to promote, the long lead time resources out of state, offshore wind, out of state or out of state wind, this could significantly help the fulfillment of resources that are in state. So anyway, I wanted to put that out there, but I think the question is that I just want to confirm that's an appropriate proposal for track 2, or is that really a TPP comment? And if so, is TPP looking at other ways of expanding the set of what's considered in the transmission planning process?
Well, I would ask either Neil or Jeff to weigh in as well, but I would say I would recommend putting those kind of comments into both proceedings that are going on. Within ours, I think that's something that's been on my mind. I know there's currently, there's a limited amount of open positions for projects to interconnect, and we're going to need many more than are available today. And what's the best way to do that? Should we, proactively be building some substations to be able to have projects come into that will feed into the projects, the transmission that is coming out of the transmission planning process. So, those type of things are going to have to be grappled with, and I think they should be grappled with here as well as in the transmission planning process. So, I would suggest you work in both arenas.
And it's Neil here. I would support that those kinds of comments. We'll be putting out the draft transmission plan around the end of the month here. We're also launching, although we're already into the 23-24 transmission planning cycle. So I'd encourage you to provide those comments into both forums as we do try to, like you said, make progress on both fronts for better shaping and helping people provide applications to improve their likelihood of success, ultimately getting a PPA and getting connected. So thanks for the comment.
Thank you.
All right, Shane O'Brien on the line, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, again, don't want to repeat some of the comments that were made, but just want to, emphasize support for, carefully considering elements 1 through 3, which seem to, go down a path uncharted so far with FERC. I think there's if you guys are concerned about the timing at all, I think there's a high chance that could get contested, and just want to make sure you guys are factoring that in. Also, especially with regards to element 3, I guess if you guys could respond to that now, just kind of curious, is the California ISO looking to potentially restrict or prohibit merchant generation participation in future CAISO markets with that proposal?
No, that's not the intention, no.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think what you guys were proposing in terms of, deliverability makes a lot of sense, but this seems to be a lot more broader than that and, potentially could limit any future merchant generation. So I guess maybe that proposal needs further clarification. One other thing I want to bring up too is, earlier during the track one discussion, I believe both you and Neil had mentioned the process being a huge constraint for dealing with the volume of interconnection requests. And I was just kind of curious why there were no elements today that were presented that specifically try to address that, if the California ISO is acknowledging that that's one of the areas that could potentially use the most improvement. And yet most of these proposals here for track two really seem like they're targeted towards limiting the competition and the amount of projects that are coming into the process.
Well, it's not our intention to limit competition. It's our intention to provide a process that can study projects on a track that allows them and allows procurement entities to move forward in a pace that brings the capacity online in order to meet our needs over the next 10 years and beyond. So I hope everybody realizes that the process that we're in right now, where we're getting this number of interconnection requests and having to extend timelines to be able to study those projects and so forth, is not a win-win situation. It's really a lose for everybody. The developers lose because they're having to wait longer for their results. The load serving entities that are procuring them have to wait longer for their results. So that means they're not going to be putting the PPAs out at a pace that is really needed to get us on, get new capacity online. The ISO and the system reliability loses by not getting the capacity online in the time frame needed. So, from our perspective, the process really needs, as Darius was saying, some major work in it to get it back to a situation where we can, again, do what we were doing in the past. We had a lot of projects coming in order to meet the 2020 requirement of 33% renewables. And the old process was able to handle that. But now with the amount of resources that are coming on to meet all of the needs for transitioning to the type of resources that the state requires, as well as to meet the load growth with transitioning to away from natural gas and electrifying a lot of the load. That's a pace that is beyond anything we've dealt with in the past, and we need to develop changes to be able to successfully meet that. And that's what we're looking to do here. So we're not looking to limit competition, and we're really looking for a way to find the best projects, put them in the fastest track to move forward.
No, I can certainly empathize with that. And I just want to encourage you again to make sure that, the proposals are meeting those intended outcomes. And, again, I understand the challenges you guys are trying to grapple with, and I'm not trying to minimize that at all. We will certainly provide some proposals in our written comments, but I was just kind of curious if, you mentioned looking to some of your neighbors, some of the other ISO entities in the United States for, potential solutions or, initiatives that they've tried in the past that they've found success dealing with similar types of issues that you're currently facing. And I was just curious, a lot of the common factors behind those are around, tightening up the process, reducing processing times, giving projects greater certainty, both with, interconnection upgrade costs and when those facilities will be in service. One of the biggest challenges we've been dealing with trying to contract some of our projects in the California ISO is the, potential in-service dates we're facing with our projects. And so, when you look at the procurement entities, the time frame they're looking for, and then, at least the estimates that the PTOs and the ISO are providing, they don't seem to be aligning very well right now. And so, I think anything you guys can do to tighten up the process, and potentially provide more but shorter, faster off-ramps for projects to get out of the process earlier, can really shore things up. And, you know, we appreciate the creative approach you guys took with Cluster 14 and trying to simplify the system studies that were done during that period to try to reduce that. And we would encourage more of that if possible. You know, one thing, and I'd like to point out in particular for consideration, you know, the Mid-Continent ISO does what they call like a screening analysis prior to starting their first formal phase of the study process. This provides, you know, again, kind of a quick and dirty screening study with all the projects that he queued up and their potential impacts and some high level cost estimates for things that, you know, again, encourage folks to get out as early as possible, provide, you know, basically penalty free withdrawal before you start to really get into the meat of the studies. And so, you know, perhaps that and other measures could be considered to try to filter projects out earlier on without necessarily discouraging them from entering in the first place.
Well, whatever ideas you have around that you would suggest would work well within our process at the ISO, we'd sure love to hear them.
Yeah, and the last thing I just want to say too is, you know, I hope that the ISO would be interested in having, you know, some perhaps regularly scheduled meetings to work through the stuff, given, you know, December will be here faster than we'd all like it to be, right? You know, perhaps maybe every 2 to 3 months to continue to work on this process and have, you know, regular discourse to help try to bring forth the best and brightest issues and work them through.
Yeah, I think we'll probably do that for, as I said earlier, for some of the elements that we'll be discussing.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Looking forward to working with you on this.
All right. We do have a question from Eddie Dadashti. Go ahead.
Thank you, Eddie Dadashti, Powers Energy. I'm very excited about the kinds of changes, Bob, that you guys and Neil have been talking about. I don't want to repeat what other people have said, but I think you're moving in a direction that you're developing what I call a renewable storage integration plan. Okay, it would be something that would be separate from your transmission plan, and in that plan, every year you announce, you know, what the needs are, what the capacities are, what the areas are, and I think something like that it would bring order to the queue that it really needs it. So anything in that direction, I think would be very helpful for all the developers. Thank you.
Well, Eddie, I think what you're describing is the IRP process at the CPUC. So resource planning is not under the purview of California ISO. That's at the CPUC.
But the capacities that are available, the areas and zones that the interconnection costs would be reasonable, you know, those are the kinds of things that you could do.
Yes, and I agree. We do plan on providing more information related to that to provide some guiding light to interconnection customers to where's the best places to interconnect and take advantage of what's being either what's available now or what's being planned in the ISO transmission planning process.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Brian Raman, go ahead.
Hi, this is Brian with Z Global. I just wanted to make a comment here that Element 3 presents a challenge for some projects out there that need to interconnect to the grid, but may not have power production or storage as a primary purpose. For example, there are some reservoir projects that are going on in the state now that water movement and water storage is a primary objective, and they may not pursue a PPA in the time frame recommended by Element 3. So we'd like to at least be sure we consider that as we go forward so we don't leave major infrastructure projects kind of stranded having to get a PPA when they may not need one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
All right, we did have a question in the chat from Sandra Kim. Oops, sorry, I'm going to come back to that one real quick. We have a question in the chat from Jason Beerwin. We have 2 questions from him. So, and also he is with GridStore LLC. The first question is, would CAISO plan to publish map shape files with priority territories? Is that possible to do prior opening to cluster 15 window?
Oh, prior to opening cluster 15? I don't think so, no. We are halfway through March, and so cluster 15 window is going to be opening pretty quick unless through the stakeholder comments we decide to take a different path. But at this point in time, I would say not before we open cluster 15. That's something we could, we've thought about and we'll continue to consider for the future, but we won't be able to turn something like that around in time for cluster 15.
And then Jason's second question is, would the auction be for an ROSR for an IX customer, or would sufficient info be made available such that an IX customer would be able to bid in an auction knowing that their winning bid would pass study without significant upgrades?
At this point, we have no meat on the bones around what an auction would look like. That's going to take a lot of discussion, and before we start to formulate what an auction would look like, we want to find out what are everybody's thoughts on having an auction in the first place, if they think that's a viable solution or not.
We also have a question from Sandra Kim, who is with Samsung. For cluster 15, if April 17 is the due to submit the deposit and cure the deficiency, why is May 1st the due to be deemed complete? Even considering 5 business days to cure any deficiency, everyone should be all set by April 24th. Is this correct?
Well, the idea is once the window closes on the 17th, whether we get it done in 5 days or 10 days, it becomes irrelevant. We're not going into the validation process right away, at least as proposed. In the past, what we do is we had to complete the completeness check within 5 business days. And if we were late on that, that would give a project more time to actually go, it would move their deadline out to be validated. Under this proposal, the validation will not occur right away, so that extra time really is not needed. Our anticipation is if we receive 300 projects, it may be difficult to complete that completeness check within 5 business days. And if there's really no need for cluster 15 under this proposal to have the completeness check done in 5 business days after the window closes, then let's not put that burden on ourselves.
All right, we do have a question in the queue from Jerry Melcher. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Jerry Melcher at the Public Advocate Office. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Bob and Neil. First thing I've got, why did not the CAISO review the PJM interconnection reforms that were approved by FERC? They appear to be effective and non-discriminatory.
Well, actually, we did review those, and at least from my perspective, I didn't do a thorough review as others I know, but they were basically moving to a cluster process that we're doing and have been doing. So I didn't see anything in there that was, new and unique that we're not either already doing or considering.
Well,
we cited the PJM order in the policy paper, so definitely well aware.
Yeah, you cited them, but you didn't put any of their measures into this proposal, and they do appear to be a lot more effective than what's being proposed. And that could be things like fees, it could be things like how they're doing the local studies and identifying capacity. There's a lot of stuff there that I think that you didn't really catch, I think, as far as what we should be doing going forward. We'll put those in our comments. The second thing I have is we're very concerned about the the delays with the Cluster 14 Phase 2, where you comment that they could be further delays due to the PTO's ability to perform. Curious on your comment in that direction. Are you saying that, oh, well, we're doing our best, but if the PTOs can't do their best, then that's on them, not on us? Did you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the PTOs are. Oh, go ahead, Neil.
Yes, it's Neil here. I was just going to comment on that, as I indicated up front, we have seen the highest percentage of projects move from phase 1 into phase 2, and that highest percentage is also applied to the largest number of phase 1 projects. So this is a significant increase in load moving into detailed phase 2 study work. And as Bob indicated at the onset, we'll be looking for the transmission owners to comment on that through this comment process as well. So like I said, we couldn't pretend that that situation wasn't there, and that that obviously raises those resource concerns, and we'll address that as we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, the last thing I have to comment on is I think there needs to be greater awareness for the CAISO to take ownership of the interconnection completeness. And what I mean by there is the Lawrence Livermore Berkeley Lab certainly raised a flag looking at all the interconnection queue delays and the time to get a new resource onto the grid. I think they mentioned it was probably about 6.5 years for the CAISO already, and it's continued to go on, even with the interconnection process enhancements that we've had, 2021, phase 1, phase 2, and the stuff here. Once you throw it over to the transom, you seem to don't take ownership or keep ownership of it to make sure a project goes to completion in a timely fashion. PTOs can drag their feet. They can say, oh, I changed my priority this year on all these different projects. But I think that the CAISO should be more aware that they are responsible for getting these projects completed, even with the PTOs as their completing agent or interconnecting agent for the physical and operational completion. But there's too much wiggle room in this whole process for someone not to perform. And that, I think, needs more priority and addressing. So thank you for responding to all my comments. We will be submitting a full set of comments.
All right.
Thanks. We do have another question from Jenny Mueller on the line. Go ahead.
Hi, Jenny Mueller, Utility System Efficiencies. I just wanted to say that my general concern about element 1 is it might be over restrictive. You know, accepting or processing only interconnection requests where a transition system has available capacity. Although I don't know the details yet for how you're going to make a determination whether or not transition system capacity is available. You know, if I take, for example, just the PG&E service territory, even projects on the San Francisco Peninsula are behind ADNUs. So I'm not entirely sure, you know, my main concern is that, you know, there's very few sites where you can go where you're not behind some sort of a constraint. And so I think that might be over restrictive.
Okay, well, please put that in your comments. You know, that's something that we look to provide more information in the future about, you know, what is going to be available, even though through future transmission planning processes. So we expect more to be available over time. One of the things that we are considering is, what if a project is seeking to interconnect in an area where there isn't available capacity? What is the path forward for them? One comment that we had discussing internally is, well, something I guess for stakeholders to consider is, if you're trying to interconnect where it's obviously been demonstrated through some information that there isn't any transmission capacity, or even if it's not been demonstrated, that those projects automatically become option B projects, and they have to fund upgrades, because those upgrades that would be required to make them deliverable are outside of the transmission planning and CPUC portfolio. So, you know, it's something we're thinking about, and we'll be looking for your thoughts on that issue as well.
All right, I think we might have lost Jenny, or she might be on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. That clears it up.
All right, thank you. And we do have a question in the chat from Frank DeRosa. Is it possible to study the load need versus studying all of the applications, determine how much load will occur and where on the system transmission expansion is optimal, regardless of how many megawatts of applications are offered?
Well, that is done in the transmission planning process.
All right. Well, I am not seeing any additional questions at this time. Actually, I see one just came in from Ellen Wolf on the line. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Ellen Wolf. I guess I'm just kind of struggling with where this goes in the long run. It seems like this approach is sort of a point in time solution, but the IRP process is dependent on commercial expression of interest. In almost all locations where IRP resources have been cited, the transmission capabilities have been exceeded, oftentimes beyond the expansion amounts that even the ISO expressed and conveyed to the IRP process. So if the IRP process is looking at commercial viability based on interconnection requests, and the CAISO is transmission planning based on the portfolios, and the interconnection requests are only being accepted where there is transmission capability, how over time does the transmission get expanded, and how does the marketplace express its preference for where it thinks those expansions are rational?
It's
Neil,
Neil.
would you like to take that on?
Yeah, it's Neil. I heard the comment a few times about existing capacity, but we were looking at this being existing and planned capacity. So there will be adjustments, of course, year over year as we work through the continued coordination with the CPUC's IRP process and the transmission planning process. But we would also expect those to largely be incremental adjustments as opposed to wholesale change, given that the transmission planning we're doing does depend on that longer term certainty around those resource planning decisions. But the focus here would be on where resource transmission is existing or planned capacity as well. Is that?
Well, that helps, but I guess the question becomes, what triggers the planned capacity? It won't be able to be triggered any longer off of commercial interest, or at least based on the interconnection queues. If resources are not allowed to enter the queue unless capability exists, then it seems like things would kind of slow to a crawl.
Well, I think though Bob was talking about this earlier, that this is a matter of balance, where we're not expecting hyper levels of competition and excessive queue volumes that actually became a barrier to moving through, to pivot all the way to, only studying, going to the other extreme. But we do need more balance, and I've heard some comments raised about some additional margins needing to be considered as in terms of the projects that get studied in different areas and so forth. And we'll look forward to feedback on that. But I don't want people thinking that this is moving from the one extreme we're at now with hyper levels of competition that actually become a barrier to rationally moving through our interconnection and resource procurement processes all the way to no competition. We need to work towards mechanisms that provide the balance.
Yeah, I agree. And I think my comment's probably a little bit outside the scope of this conversation, but it just seems that things come very strongly to hinge on the transmission capabilities, both existing and planned, that are generated at the CAISO without always a lot of clarity to the stakeholder community and the generation developers. So maybe a side pitch for the importance of a lot of vetting of those capabilities existing and planned.
Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the meeting. It was very interesting.
We did get a question in the chat. Let's see, this is from Lucas Moeller. Would CAISO consider an alternative study timeline for energy-only applications? Most of the issues discussed appear to be deliverability upgrade focused.
Well, I would say we really haven't in the past. There's a significant number of projects in the queue that are energy only. Procurement currently is pretty much targeting for projects with full capacity delivery status, even though that there are some amounts of energy only projects or capacity within the portfolios that are provided to us. We haven't seen that make its way into the procurement process yet. So I think we're going to need some help from the procurement entities to know when are they going to actually start procuring energy only projects? And, do we need to do something like that to where we have a path for energy only projects that might be different? At this point, we didn't envision one, but please provide your thoughts and your comments.
And we did just get some brief comments from C.D. McLean at the CEC, just urging caution around concepts like too much competition, and to the extent that there is need for these terms, that usage be accompanied by citations to economic literature. So we'll note that.
Okay, thank you.
And that is it for questions at this time.
Okay, we'll turn it over to you, Caitlin.
All right, thank you. So thanks again to Neil and Bob for such a great presentation, and to all of our stakeholders for participating today. Just briefly, the next steps for this initiative shown on the screen is the IPE 2023 Track 1 initiative schedule. As you can see, we've posted the issue paper and straw proposal. We held our stakeholder conference call today, and the next step is to submit your stakeholder comments, and then we'll be publishing the draft tariff language and final proposal. We'll do an additional round of opening up for stakeholder comments on those items, and a stakeholder conference call to wrap it up before going to the Board of Governors for consideration. And then we do have a note here on the bottom that the schedule for Track 2 will be developed once stakeholder feedback is received on this issue paper and straw proposal. And this is, to me, the proposed schedule for implementing process changes ahead of commencing Cluster 15 Phase 1 studies. It is anticipated that Track 2 would need to be presented to the board in December of 2023. And like I said, comments are due for the issue paper and straw proposal March 27th. You can submit your comments using the commenting tool linked on the initiative webpage. There on the second bullet point of this slide is the link to the stakeholder initiative webpage. Again, that is under the Stay Informed tab on the California ISO webpage. If you have any questions, feel free to contact ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. And again, thank you so much for your participation today. Have a great rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.